welcome to DCF Investigations. Imagine a city on the cusp of a transformation. Austin, Texas, in 1991, was not yet the sprawling metropolis of high-rise tech giants and international festivals that it is today. It was a college town, a place known for its laid-back atmosphere, its live music, and a sense of safety that bordered on naivety. It was a place where parents felt comfortable letting their teenagers work the closing shift at a local dessert shop on a Friday night. But that innocence was shattered in a single hour of extreme violence. An event that would scar the city's collective memory forever and launch one of the most complex, controversial, and frustrating manhunts in American history. We're talking about the Austin yogurt shop murders. To truly understand the magnitude of this tragedy, we must first look at the lives that were stolen. These were not just names in a police file. They were vibrant young women with their entire futures waiting for them. Jennifer Harbison was 17 years old, a responsible and hardworking senior at Lanier High School. She was the kind of teenager parents dream of having, exhibiting a maturity beyond her years. She was the shift manager at the I Can't Believe It's Yogurt shop on West Anderson Lane, a role she took seriously. She was a leader, a protector, and a beloved friend. Working alongside her that night was 17-year-old Eliza Thomas. Eliza was a spirited, funny, and warm-hearted student from Crockett High School. She was the kind of person who could light up a room, known for her deep loyalty to her friends and her infectious laugh. She and Jennifer made a good team, balancing the responsibilities of the shop with the chatter and dreams of teenage life. Then there were the two younger girls, who weren't employees, but had come to the shop to keep Jennifer company and get a ride home. Sarah Harbison was Jennifer's 15-year-old sister. She was a freshman at Lanier High, looking up to her big sister, eager to soak in the Friday night atmosphere. And with Sarah was her best friend, 13-year-old Amy Ayers. Amy was the youngest of the group, a seventh grader who loved horses and had a quiet, gentle strength. She was an innocent bystander in the truest sense, just a child hanging out with the older girls she admired. The date was December 6th, 1991. It was a chilly Friday night in Austin. The shop, located in a strip mall, was a popular spot for families and teenagers. Throughout the evening, customers came and went, oblivious to the fact that they were witnessing the final hours of 4 young lives. Witnesses later recalled seeing the girls laughing, serving yogurt, and cleaning up. The atmosphere was normal. It was mundane. And that normalcy makes what happened next even more terrifying. As the clock ticked toward closing time at 11:00 p.m., the girls began their closing routine. They put the chairs up on the tables. They counted the cash. They prepared to lock the doors and head home to their families. But they never made it out. Shortly before midnight, a patrolling police officer named Troy Gay noticed smoke billowing from the strip mall. He initially thought the building itself was on fire. He called it in, and the Austin Fire Department responded rapidly. When firefighters arrived, they found the yogurt shop filled with thick, black smoke. They broke through the glass windows and began dousing the interior with high-pressure water hoses to combat the flames. It is here, in the chaos of the fire response, that the investigation suffered its first and perhaps most critical blow. The firefighters, operating under the assumption that they were fighting a standard structure fire, unleashed thousands of gallons of water into the shop. They were doing their job, trying to save property and prevent the fire from spreading to adjacent businesses. They had no way of knowing that they were washing away hair, fibers, fingerprints, and crucial biological evidence. The crime scene was effectively destroyed before it was even identified as a crime scene. Once the fire was knocked down, firefighters moved into the back of the shop to check for hot spots. What they found in the rear storage room was a scene of such horror that it traumatized veteran first responders. Huddled together on the floor were the bodies of the 4 girls. They had been stripped, bound with their own clothing, and shot in the head execution style. The perpetrators had then stacked their bodies and set the shop on fire in a deliberate attempt to incinerate the evidence. The sheer brutality of the act sent shockwaves through the police department. This was not a robbery gone wrong. The ruthlessness suggested a level of malice that was hard to comprehend. The killers had taken the time to bind the girls, to gag them, and to execute them one by one. Ballistic evidence recovered from the scene indicated that 2 different weapons were used, a .22 caliber and a .380 caliber. This suggested at least 2 perpetrators were involved. As news of the murders broke the next morning, Austin fell into a state of panic. The parents of the victims, who had spent the night calling friends and hospitals when their daughters didn't come home, were delivered the devastating news. The community reaction was visceral. Sales of home security systems skyrocketed. Parents refused to let their children work night shifts. The slacker innocence of Austin evaporated, replaced by a fearful vigilance. The Austin Police Department, under immense pressure from the public and the media, launched a massive investigation. In the days following the murders, they received thousands of tips. Every white car seen in the area was reported. Every suspicious character was flagged. The police released sketches of 2 men seen sitting in a booth in the shop shortly before closing. But despite massive publicity, these men were never positively identified or cleared, remaining ghostly figures in the case file. The early years of the investigation were marked by frustration. With the physical evidence compromised by the fire and the water, detectives had to rely heavily on witness statements and informants. They looked at everyone. They investigated serial killers known to be operating in Texas at the time. One prominent theory involved Kenneth McDuff, the broomstick killer, who was on parole and in the area during the time of the murders. McDuff was a monster who had kidnapped and murdered women across Texas. And the execution-style nature of the yogurt shop killings bore some resemblance to his methods. However, despite intense scrutiny, no physical evidence ever linked McDuff to the yogurt shop, and he was eventually executed for other crimes, taking any secrets he had to the grave. Another avenue of investigation focused on the possibility of a random drifter or a group of out-of-towners passing through on the interstate. But the specific nature of the crime, the control of 4 victims, the arson, the back exit, suggested perpetrators who were comfortable with the location and perhaps knew the closing routines. As months turned into years, the case grew cold. The families of Jennifer, Sarah, Eliza, and Amy lived in a state of suspended agony, waiting for answers that never came. The yellow ribbons tied around the trees in Austin began to fade, but the demand for justice did not. Then, in the late 1990s, nearly 8 years after the murders, the investigation took a dramatic turn. A new team of detectives was assigned to the cold case, bringing fresh eyes and a renewed determination. They began to revisit old leads, specifically focusing on a group of young men who had been briefly looked at in the days immediately following the crime. This brings us to the 4 suspects who would become the center of a legal firestorm. Maurice Pierce, Forrest Wellborn, Michael Scott, and Robert Springsteen. In 1991, these four were teenagers who hung around the North Cross Mall just down the street from the yogurt shop. A few days after the murders, Maurice Pierce had been arrested at the mall for possession of a weapon, a .22 caliber pistol. At the time, ballistics testing did not match his gun to the bullets found at the crime scene, and the lead was dropped. However, the new detectives believed that the ballistics technology of 1991 might have been insufficient, or that the connections between the boys had been overlooked. They theorized that this group of mall rats, known for petty crimes and delinquency, had escalated to robbery and murder. In 1999, the police brought the men in for questioning. The interrogation tactics used during these sessions would later become the subject of intense legal and ethical debate. The detectives interrogated Michael Scott and Robert Springsteen for hours on end. They used high-pressure techniques, allegedly feeding the suspects details about the crime scene that only the killers or the police would know. Eventually, both Scott and Springsteen cracked. They gave confessions. In their statements, they implicated themselves, each other, and the other two men, Maurice Pierce and Forrest Wellborn. They described the robbery, the sexual assault of the girls, and the shootings. To the detectives and the district attorney, this was the breakthrough they had been praying for. They had confessions. They had a solved case. But there was a problem. A massive problem. There was absolutely no physical evidence linking any of the four men to the crime scene. No fingerprints matched. No hair matched. The gun seized from Maurice Pierce in 1991 was retested and still did not match the ballistics. The entire case rested on the confessions of Scott and Springsteen. Despite the lack of physical evidence, the state proceeded with the prosecution. The trials began in the early 2000s and were nothing short of a spectacle. The courtroom was packed with the weeping families of the victims, the media, and a community desperate for closure. Robert Springsteen was tried first. The prosecution painted him as a cold-blooded killer. They played his taped confession for the jury. The defense argued that the confession was coerced, a fabrication created by a man breaking under psychological torture. They pointed out the inconsistencies between the confession and the actual crime scene details. But the jury believed the confession. Springsteen was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. Michael Scott was tried next. His defense team also argued false confession, highlighting Scott's low IQ and susceptibility to suggestion. But again, the jury was swayed by the taped admission of guilt. Scott was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Charges against Maurice Pierce and Forrest Wellborn were eventually dropped due to a lack of evidence. Pierce spent time in jail but was never convicted of the murders. Wellborn was never indicted. For a brief moment, it seemed like the case was closed. Two men were in prison, and the state considered the matter resolved. However, the legal battle was far from over. The convictions of Scott and Springsteen were built on a shaky foundation. In 2004, the United States Supreme Court made a landmark ruling in the case of Crawford versus Washington. This ruling reinforced the Confrontation Clause of the Sixth Amendment, stating that out-of-court statements by witnesses who do not testify at trial cannot be used against a defendant. In the trials of Scott and Springsteen, the prosecution had used Springsteen's confession against Scott and Scott's confession against Springsteen, even though neither man testified against the other in court. This meant the defendants were denied their constitutional right to confront their accuser. Based on this legal technicality, the convictions were overturned by the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. The state was gearing up to retry them when the case was hit by a scientific bombshell. By 2008, DNA technology had advanced light years beyond what was available in 1991 or even 1999. The defense teams for Scott and Springsteen demanded new testing on the biological evidence that had survived the fire and the water. Specifically, they wanted to test vaginal swabs taken from the victims. The results were shocking. A distinct male DNA profile was found inside the youngest victim, 13-year-old Amy Ayers. This was YSTR DNA, which traces the male lineage. The results were conclusive. The DNA did not match Robert Springsteen. It did not match Michael Scott. It did not match Maurice Pierce. It did not match Forrest Wellborn. It was the DNA of an unknown male. This revelation shattered the state's theory. The prosecution had argued that these 4 men, and only these 4 men, were responsible. Yet, here was undeniable scientific proof that an unknown male was directly involved in the assault of the youngest victim. If the confessions were true, why was this 5th person never mentioned? If the confessions were false, then the real killers were still out there. Faced with this insurmountable exculpatory evidence, the district attorney had no choice. In 2009, all charges against Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott were dismissed. They were released from prison, having spent nearly a decade behind bars for a crime that science suggested they did not commit. The release of the suspects reopened the wounds of the victims' families. For years, they had believed that the monsters who killed their daughters were behind bars. Now, they were back to square one. The emotional toll was devastating. They had sat through trials, heard horrific details, and believed justice was served, only to have it snatched away. Since 2009, the case has remained in a frustrating limbo. The investigation is technically open, but it is a cold case in the truest sense. The unknown male DNA profile has been run through CODIS, the National DNA Database, thousands of times. It has been checked against felons, arrestees, and forensic samples from across the country. To this day, there has been no match. This leads us to the myriad of theories that continue to circulate about what happened that night. The most prevalent theory among law enforcement loyalists is that the original suspects were indeed involved. But they had an accomplice, a 5th man who left the DNA. They argue that the confessions were largely true, but the suspects protected the identity of the final participant. However, critics point out that it is highly unlikely that Scott and Springsteen would confess to capital murder and face the death penalty while protecting a 5th accomplice. Another theory is that the investigators developed tunnel vision. By focusing so intensely on the mall rats, they may have ignored other viable suspects. Some armchair detectives and independent investigators believe the answer lies in the initial sketches of the 2 men in the booth. Were they the killers? Did they leave town immediately after? There is also the theory of a traveling killer. Interstate 35 runs straight through Austin. A perpetrator could have exited the highway, committed the crime, and been 300 miles away by sunrise. This would explain the lack of local connections and the failure to find a DNA match in the local databases. We must also consider the forensic tragedy of the fire. If the shop hadn't been flooded, would we have found fingerprints on the cash register? Would we have found footprints in the back room? The destruction of the crime scene is a ghost that haunts this case. It is a stark reminder of how fragile justice can be, dependent on the chaotic variables of the first few minutes of a response. The legacy of the Austin yogurt shop murders is profound. It changed the way the Austin Police Department handles major crimes. It changed the way the community views safety. It highlighted the dangers of coerced confessions and the vital importance of DNA preservation. But for the families of Jennifer, Sarah, Eliza, and Amy, the legacy is one of enduring pain and unanswered questions. They have grown older while their daughters remain forever frozen in time, forever 17, 15, and 13. They have fought tirelessly to keep the case in the public eye, urging authorities to utilize the newest advancements in forensic genealogy. Forensic genealogy, the same technology that caught the Golden State Killer, offers the best hope for solving this case. By building a family tree from the unknown DNA profile, investigators could potentially track down distant relatives of the killer and narrow down the suspect pool. It is a complex and expensive process, but it is the path that holds the most promise. As we stand here today, decades removed from that cold December night in 1991, the yogurt shop on West Anderson Lane is no longer there. The building has housed different businesses over the years, the physical scars of the fire long since repaired, but the spiritual scar on the city remains. The killer, or killers, are likely still out there. They have lived their lives. They may have married, had children, and grown old, carrying the dark secret of what they did to 4 innocent girls. Or perhaps they are dead, having taken the truth with them. The Austin yogurt shop murders remains one of the most haunting, unsolved mysteries in American crime history. It is a story of innocence lost, of a botched investigation, of legal battles, and of a science that both liberated the accused and deepened the mystery. We must remember Jennifer Harbison. We must remember Sarah Harbison. We must remember Eliza Thomas. We must remember Amy Ayers. We must not let their stories fade into the archives of cold cases. As we conclude this deep dive, I want to leave you with a question that plagues every detective who has ever touched this file. If the DNA found at the scene belongs to the killer, and that DNA does not match any of the men who confessed, what does that tell us about the nature of truth in the criminal justice system? Does it prove that an innocent man can be coerced into admitting to the most heinous of crimes? Or does it prove that evil can be shared by more people than we can imagine? This has been a production of DCF Investigations. If you have any information regarding the Austin yogurt shop murders, no matter how small or insignificant you think it might be, please contact the Austin Police Department Cold Case Unit. Justice has no expiration date. What do you think happened that night? Do you believe the original suspects were involved? Or is there a shadow figure who has evaded capture for over 30 years? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Stay vigilant, stay safe, and never stop searching for the truth.